Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. So a bit about myself to start off. My name's George. I'm a senior quality engineer at Pendo. I've been in Pendo for about over a year now. I'm based out of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. So I have about 6 years or so testing experience. And for the past 2 years or so, I've been working with automated testing, Cypress more specifically. Cool. So about Pendo. So at Pendo, we provide a platform for digital product teams. We have products that provide usage analytics, feedback, and user guidance, all without needing engineering resources. So by that, I mean that little to no code needs to be written to capture the data that's gathered by our products. So that's a short version of what you're seeing on the screen. We have 7 offices worldwide, ranging from our HQ in Raleigh in the US to London and Tokyo and obviously sunny Sheffield. We have 1,700 customers and over 500 employees. And with articles like these, you can see that we're growing, expanding, hiring. Pendo is very much on the move, and it's a very exciting time for us. So as a reminder, like as Gleb said, we're having the Q&A at the end, so you can pop onto Slido and use the event code CY-Pendo for any questions that you have. Okay, so to talk about our products, so you can see quite a big quite a big list here of products that we have. As I mentioned previously, we're providing usage analytics, feedback, and user guidance. So we have insights, sentiment, these different products. We're understanding what users do. We're capturing how they feel, trying to figure out what they want. So Pendo collects information on how users are using the software product. Front end is mainly Angular and Vue. So we're still working to move upper parts of the application across to Vue. So still using both. Our backend's primarily Go, but we do have an application that runs in Ruby. So out of these apps, we're going to be specifically talking today about guidance. So guidance provides personalized in-app guides and messaging. So as I mentioned about how Pendo collects information on how users are using a software product, guides allows users to actually take actions on those learnings. So you can see from the screenshot on the left, user onboarding and tutorials, we can highlight an area of a product and draw attention to it, provide information in the form of like a guide, so a tour of a new area that people can click into, or if they're already familiar with it, then they can just close out of it and skip out of a tour. You can also highlight new features. So in this screenshot on the right, there's dashboard filters. You can draw attention to it, provide a link to show me more information about it. It's really easy way to say, here's a brand new feature of ours. Come and have a look at it.
Right.
Yeah. So you can create polls and surveys as well. So these can be used to capture feedback on the new products and features. So as I mentioned about creating guides to walk through a new feature, a product can be used to capture how they actually feel about it. And then using our core product, metrics can be tracked based off the feedback that's provided. So in the screenshots, we can see how you could create a guide to get information on how likely somebody is to recommend a certain feature to another teammate. And then on the right, we can see where somebody can leave feedback and they can actually leave a text-based response, so you can gather more qualitative data on how your product's being used.
So George, if you have a web app, you can just install Pendo SDK, and then all this information will start flowing back to you, right? And you'll know what your users really think about it.
Yeah, so Pendo will actually sit on the website and track this information, and I'll talk a bit more into detail about how we track those events and such. But yeah, it'll sit on the website in the form of like a snippet.
Perfect.
And just to call out resource centers as well that can be created. So these can be these house additional help for users. So they can include guides, announcements, FAQs, help article links. So the screenshot on the left shows like a bit more clear information on a resource center. So when I say it contains guides, somebody could click into a resource center and click into a list of guides if they wanted to have a list available as walkthroughs for an application. They can all be listed there with progress about how far they've got through them. Announcements for new features, so clicking into them, seeing the guides for those. But also FAQs, help article links off to external resources as well. And the integration piece, so at the bottom there, you can see for like technical support, you can integrate technical support into the resource center where somebody can submit a ticket if they're running into like an issue within your application. So just talk a bit about the activation types of these guides and just show how they would appear. So the first one's automatic. So you can see this is just a page loading and a guide's just appearing automatically, putting like an overlay over the page to highlight the information that's being displayed. We can also have them display in the form of a badge. So for any keen eyes, there's actually a small icon over this page, which is like a little informative icon that somebody can click or hover over, and that will make the guide appear. So that can also draw attention to an area of the product that you want them to see.
Yeah, like a new feature, right? You want to put an icon and then the user clicks on it to find out, then you show it.
Yeah, exactly. Or even anchored to the target element. So here you can see there's like like an alert symbol that somebody can click on, and it can cause the guide to appear. So rather than having the actual information, you could just tie it to an element itself, and that again can be a click or a hover that will just make the guide pop up. So how do we do this? So in terms of creating the guides, users can launch the Visual Design Studio over their application, and then user can create guides that are going to target the features or pages where required. So I've got a bit of a clip here I can just walk through, and this is from our website. There's like a guides tour on the site, so I'm just kind of stepping through this. So you'll see as part of our core product, we have a list of guides, and we can just create one in the top right corner. Then we'll see
so it's like a guide to creating a guide.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the part where it's a bit guideception. So you're actually seeing guides appear over these steps, but we can just skip over those for now. So this is where you'll get like a list of layouts that you can choose from. In this example, we're just going to choose a basic light box with no other information. And then this is where you can choose from different content that you want to add into the step. So for this example, we're just going to add a text block. And here we're creating a free trial message to notify a user that the free trial is going to expire for the application they're using. We can then add buttons into it. So by adding a couple of buttons in, we can then show, if you want to continue using the product or if you're not interested. Save then, just to close and finish that up. And then we're taking back into the actual core product of Pendo. And just to highlight here, in this example, we're actually going to segment the guide. So this is where we kind of go back into the integration with the rest of our products, and we can actually provide a segment for when the guide should appear. So here one's been created for a trial that's expiring in 3 days. So it's going based off some criteria that they've already seen the homepage of the app. That'd indicate that they've already logged in at least once, and they only have 3 days remaining in the free trial before it expires. Then we want this message to pop up. And then here in the example, we're going to change the state of the guide. So by default, they'll be created in draft mode. We can actually set them into public. And that's the state that will make it appear over the actual web application. And then the state will just preview it. You can see this is how it'll appear on the page. So as I showed from the other kind of basic examples with little text, this is where you can then have like a free trial message with an overlay highlighting it. And that's where you can see if you want to continue the subscription or whatever account you have, or if you don't want to. And as you mentioned about how we sit on the website, this is where when a user, if they hit the close button in the top right or like the no thanks, those events are still tracked as well. So you can still track the process of, how many people may be continuing versus just closing. We track who sees the guide and such as well. So it's not just a case of looking at who's clicked yes here. It's looking at every bit of the every option really that's available.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So to summarize a bit more with the Visual Design Studio. So as I mentioned, used for building the guides. So talking about what abilities and what can be created, we're talking about different types of guides. So polls, surveys, even the resource centers. Users have the freedom to implement different types of content. So I literally just show text and buttons, but images, videos, links, it can get quite complex. And especially then when users decide to combine these and build them at different lengths, you get more and more kind of complexities thrown in. And even the fact that we're launching them over any customer site. Yeah. So any type of web application, any type of ruling can get a bit complex. And a fancy little bonus point, we attract great customers with products like these. So I thought it'd be very nice to call out that these customers will then go on to create beautiful walkthroughs. So as you can see here, anyone who's used Cypress dashboard might have seen this. I don't know how much of a hand you had in these, Gleb, or if you
this is the attractive part, because this is completely on top of existing application, right? So marketing person can do, billing, sales department, whoever wants to add those guides and highlight the new features can do it themselves using the studio. Like you don't have to change your website. You don't have to add more code there to implement this. This is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was saying at the start with the kind of little to no code approach. Once you set up, we're empowering product managers to go in and create these resources themselves without hitting roadblocks or anything. So yeah, beautiful walkthroughs, stunning polls, as we can see this one in Cypress dashboard as well, and delightful resource centers. So this is where you can see before you can link into like FAQs and announcements and such.
Yeah. And I like how it's linked right into the application, right? Because that's important. When you're stuck on something, you want to immediately find out the answer to your problem, not go to documentation, search there. You want right there, right where you're having problem. So it's great.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so to talk a bit about our state before Cypress, so where we were at. So in manual testing, we did run into functionality issues when we were performing release tests. And what we found then is time spent working on testing these functionality issues was more than we desired. We really wanted to spend more time focusing on these potential use cases, as I alluded to before. So every single release, rather than just checking, a certain kind of basic button works, we want to be looking at edge cases for scenarios like these. So we've got a lot of different guide types to test, different guide content. Users may want to create single step guides. That's the example we've shown, but you could get 15 step guides. If somebody wants to walk through an entire product in a set of a guide, we support that. I got into the guide activations, the different ways that they appear, the elements that can be anchored to and launching over any customer site. So that's where CSS rules and such come in. There's a lot here that we would like to cover from a manual testing perspective, and we wanted to make sure we had time to cover and dig into those edge cases. More so than just focusing on the functionality of the product itself. If we could manage that another way,
I don't see a problem. Just hire more people. No.
Yeah. That's no way. Well, funnily enough, at the time we were at this stage, I think it's about the time I joined. So just over a year ago, we were making this push. So that's one solution that we went for.
Make sure when you start with automated, you are hired first and then start automation.
So, well, talking about the automated testing. So, funnily enough, for the start of this process, Pendo did have some pain points with getting started. We did run into some false starts using test automation frameworks, but rather than kind of digging specific, I thought it might be a bit more beneficial to kind of talk a bit generally about the problems you can run into, and everyone might relate to these different points of what can cause like a false start when trying to create an automation suite and commit to it. So one of the problems, first off, can be flaky and unstable tests. So I'll be talking a lot about that really today. But this is really the point where you're running a test suite and it's reporting failures, but they're not accurate. A point where you have a test suite that people need to jump on when there's a failure, and we're treating it as a top failure. There's a failure in our application that could potentially block the release. Let's jump on it. And then you look at it and it's a problem with a test and you just rerun it. It's a big deal, and it affects people's opinions and the kind of integrity of the suite if it isn't doing its job of alerting of app failures, not of test failures. Inconsistent test patterns can affect like the adoption of a test suite. So if you've got people from different backgrounds working with tests of different size, different kind of assertions, standpoints, even the storing of web elements. So when using like page object model, if people are more comfortable with XPaths versus selectors, if you find that there's inconsistencies within an automation framework, it can be quite hard to drive adoption for a team if everybody does things a bit differently.
Right.
Lack of visibility and test and results. So if a automation suite maybe is worked on by one of two people in a team or across an all engineering team, that can be a bit difficult to drive for, especially when it goes hand in hand with onboarding and prior knowledge. So those can be required. If you have a suite that only certain people know how to run, and to understand how to run those tests, you're going to have to take like an afternoon out and such. Or if that person's off, people don't know how to run them, it can be quite restrictive, and it can stop the test from really getting the go that we need to actually drive and provide benefit. And these things can lead to a lack of team adoption, which I was already kind of alluding to, and a lack of leadership buy-in. So if the team don't feel comfortable running and owning the tests, or they don't see the value in them because they're not providing stable results, then they're not going to put as much time into them. And from a leadership perspective, if the tests aren't delivering value, if that value isn't being shown because there isn't visibility of what's being covered, it can be difficult to get them prioritized then at that point, especially when you're moving fast and you've got features to work on and such. And then this can lead to lack of maintenance and iterations. So at that point, this is how it all kind of comes together. The pack then isn't maintained, it isn't iterated on. And it's important to kind of call this out because you want to find ways to solve these solutions. That's what we were looking for. We wanted to make sure that we're implementing something that is going to run and that we're going to stick with and push on with throughout. So as I mentioned at the time, all eyes were on quality. This is about the time that I joined Pendo, and there was a huge drive for quality culture within engineering teams. And this comes from Pendo, across Pendo. And one of the big points of that is that everyone owns the quality of our products. So this isn't just quality engineers, every front-end engineer, everybody who's working on the product, we're all ensuring that it's a good standard, that it's of high quality. So one of the things we wanted to do was to revise our implemented automation. We wanted to look to try and catch these regressions that I spoke about, these functionality issues. We wanted to free up that time that was spent manually testing on these customer problems and use cases that I spoke about, where you can run into kind of wild edge cases a lot more so than just basic issues. We wanted to spend more time digging into those. And that's where Cypress comes in.
Well, now I'm intrigued.
Right. So we need a tool that worked for the many and not just for the few. So getting into that, I showed the list of products that we have. As an engineering team, we collaborate quite a lot. And as I say team, I don't mean like a single Scrum team, more like at a departmental level. So everybody's representing the different products. Everybody wants to work in the same way, and we all want to be able to help each other. And when discussing Cypress initially, we found it had a good reputation. A lot of people recommended it, even from the wider community. It was quite interesting for me to hop on a call and talk about Cypress from Sheffield in the same way that somebody else felt about it in Raleigh. So we all had like the same shared opinions, and that was a real big move for us to be able to say, yeah, we've heard great things. We all really like it. It was easy to get up and running. So visiting Cypress site, you'll see how easy it is just to get it installed with a new product, a new project, or adding it to an existing one. And there's lots of documentation and community-driven questions and answers online. So I couldn't resist here. It's nice to hit up a website that isn't Stack Overflow when you're looking into issues. I find that digging through Cypress docs and even closed issues in Cypress where people have raised questions is a really good way of learning and finding out more information. Cool. So that's where Cypress comes in again. So looking here at the problems and solutions. So I talked a bit about those problems, and this is where Cypress was ticking the boxes for us. So flaky and unstable tests answered with Cypress retries. I'll talk a bit about our usage of that. Inconsistent test patterns. So Cypress advocates for the best practice of using data attributes, which we adhere to. The static waits. I didn't call this out specifically, but you can have static waits within tests where you're waiting for 3 seconds or 5 seconds for something to happen. As people may know, as soon as you kind of chuck those into CI, you either run into issues with the tests, or you find that your test suite can become quite bloated when you've got an entire team of people doing that across multiple files. So following Cypress recommendation and feature of waiting on aliases and or assertions, so you can stack assertions to kind of slow down the test, or you can wait on a particular network call or something to rather than waiting for a certain amount of time. I'll show our example of how we do that as well. So the lack of visibility is answered by Cypress dashboard, which I'll talk a ton about as well, and our usage of that. And onboarding or prior knowledge required. So we're looking at front-end tests with detailed documentation. So I called out the docs, but also I find it's quite refreshing when you're writing front-end tests in a front-end language. It feels like it's quite easy to kind of push to a team when you say, here's this, test framework that we're using, and it's all in JavaScript, rather than trying to get people to maybe move into Python or something that they're not as comfortable with. Mm-hmm. I find that this then ticks the boxes. You've got team adoption when you're able to adhere to consistent patterns and make it easy for people to jump in and work on the tests. You've then got leadership buy-in when you're able to provide visibility and benefits that the tests provide. So using something like Cypress dashboard, showing here's the coverage of what we're doing, This is the results and the kind of consistent results. It's good to see, and it's easy to get the tests and the work prioritized. And then that leads to the maintenance of them. One of the tests are prioritized to work on, and the team are comfortable taking ownership of them. You see the iterations come through and the improvements made, as well as the test being maintained going forward. Okay, so I'll talk about using Cypress to rebuild our guides test suite. So as a first step, we need to define test suite coverage. So we went for the approach of creating a sanity suite and a regression suite. So anyone who's already familiar with those definitions will kind of know what I'm getting at, but I'll talk a bit about them anyway. So for our sanity suite, we decided that we wanted the test to run on all branches and block merge. So that's every dev branch that's going into master or any of our releases. For the regression suite, we initially decided to schedule the run nightly on the release branch rather than put it straight into our pipeline due to the amount of testing that we plan to do and how much detail it'll go into. So yeah, saying that, Sanity Suite is a light touch of all areas, while the Regression Suite is full coverage of the Visual Design Studio. And for the Sanity Suite, the tests are dependent on environment resources, whilst in the Regression Suite, they're independent and create their own resources so they can be pointed at any environment. So this is useful for us when Sanity, we need it to move fast. We're going to use an existing guide, point the tests at it, and run through a bunch of quick checks for every PR. While for the Regression Suite, we're going to be building up those guides. We're going to be creating them for every single test, which obviously can be a lot more heavy and take a lot more longer to run. But then the benefit comes from that then that we're pointing them at any environment. So as long as we have an environment on Pendo configured, we can just point these tests. They'll create their own guides. They'll do everything themselves, which is really great for us. And then, so yeah, mentioning that, we need to work on the infrastructure setup and configuration. So we already had the environments. We already have quite an extensive pipeline with these environments already configured, set up, deployed. So we're just kind of plugging into that. So we just need to configure the data. We need to look at a way to create the users. So we have like an in-house solution of how to authenticate and start these tests. And then we need the tools to clean up the data. So even though Cypress recommends that you can clean up the data before like running the test, the only problem we really had was that we just needed to clean up the data to not stress the environment. So if we're creating, hundreds of guides a day or however many overnight, we need to make sure they're not getting left there to pile up for long periods of time. So yeah, then it's working on building the Sanity Suite, building the Regression Suite. And this is quite a key point, being able to document a maintenance process. So thanks to Cypress's best practices, and the fact that we have Slack integration, which I'll talk about on Cypress dashboard, we're actually able to not only create a test suite, but then say, right, how do we want to look after this test suite? How do we want to commit to it, iterate on it, improve it? And that was a big part of it for us as well. So the outcome. So I'm going to show this in the representation of like a pipeline. Like I say, we already had one that was pretty extensive, but I want to show kind of how Cypress would just plug in. So the first point, we have the ability to manually trigger these tests. So not as beneficial for Sanity as it's running constantly, but if we're working on a branch where we're doing like a major version change, we might be, affecting potentially various areas of the application. Being able to just point the regression suite at that branch and run it manually is a big win for us. So we're able to do that. As I mentioned, scheduling the runs, running them overnight. That's an initial point that we did, which we have the functionality for, which is good. And running them on branch merge. So as I mentioned about Sanity, just running on every PR that we pass. We already have all that functionality there. And then, as you can see, Sanity and Regression plug it into our CI, and then I'll talk about our test case management system that we use and how we're reporting into Cypress dashboard and Slack, kind of talking about what happens once we finish running those tests. Into regression. So I picked out what I feel like was an interesting test as an example, and I couldn't help myself with a bit of fun with this one. I don't know if anyone ever will have said iframes and fun in the same sentence, but here we go. So I'm just going to walk through this manually before showing it running Cypress. So this is me using our Visual Design Studio. As you notice, there's little step differences here because I'm not actually using the website walkthrough. This is the actual application. So I'm adding a step and I'm choosing a light box similar to as we did before. And I'm just going to turn off here the backdrop so you can see there's a whole bunch of iframes that we're using here, iframes within iframes. And the idea of this test is we need to make sure that changes we're applying are spanning across multiple iframes, not just a singular one. And I'm calling this one out as an example because this is where testing gets quite complicated and where we found that it was quite easy to implement something like this with Cypress rather than with some tools, you might kind of step away from tests like these and just keep them as a manual effort until you felt comfortable committing to creating such a test. So here I'm just going to show how we can target this particular step to an element. So I'm just selecting the title here. And you can see that we know it's selected because it's highlighted in red to indicate this is the element that the step's now been targeted to. Now, one of the features is we can just enter the custom CSS ourselves. And with that, if I enter to look for a div, what the test here that we're carrying out is to make sure that it's finding all the different divs across the multiple frames and that we're returning an error for that. We need a user to be targeting an individual element here, not one that's used in multiple places. So we need to make sure that the error messages are appearing. We need to make sure that they're being highlighted. And we need to make sure that our alert section as well is returning that there's been a problem and that we can then provide them a link to solve that problem. So here we can then update the target element from the link in the alerts and then just select it back to title and see that they go away. So there's a fair bits to that around. The test itself in its premise is quite simple of we're making a short change and checking that the change has taken place, but it's the actual detail of checking these multiple elements, having Cypress assert on all of this, as well as the alert section, and then updating and making sure that then the error messages go away and such. There's quite a bit to that. So to talk through the code. So as I mentioned, we're putting in our before call and an after for grabbing the users. This is like an in-house solution, but you can see here that we're using custom commands in Cypress to do this. So we're just getting the user and returning them to the pool afterwards. As a before step, we're also launching the guides. We're intercepting a couple of routes here. You might have noticed a slight delay when I was adding the step. That's where we want to wait on the routes that are being called. We don't want to just say, wait for a second while the step loads. And then we're creating the actual guide itself. So that's why I mentioned with these regression tests, we're actually launching in all the resources. So if this was an example with multiple tests, we'd be throwing a before each in here and running these upon each test.
Yeah.
So I called out adding the new step. So we just click to add, and then we'd wait for the themes and layouts to load, make sure that's successful before going any further in the test.
And I like how you're using page object model and like normal Cypress commands. It's absolutely, I think, good practice to kind of abstract some operations, but you don't have to abstract everything into your own object just to call like side-weight intercept.
Yeah, and it's been good for us because one of the things with page object model on a product like ours is keeping it clean as well and keeping it organized. Yeah. And it feels like there's a nice differentiation for us in what should be a custom command versus what we can put into a page file. So Cypress helps us do that as well, which is really cool.
Cool.
And then just to call out the page, so we'd have a separate file for this, but for this example, I've just kind of added it to the bottom so you can see we'd have a new step button and we'd be finding an actual data CY attribute here for guide step add, which would be adding the step. And in keen eyes here, I'll see that we're actually finding it from the action bar iframe. And that's because in our test, we're testing the Visual Design Studio, which is an iframe over a page. So that's where POM can get like a little complicated, but it works for us while we're keeping it clean.
Yeah, it might just require a couple of explicit steps in Cypress to like find this iframe, then find this iframe, and then find the element you're looking for.
Exactly that. Yeah. Okay, so to see Cypress run this, you'll see some similar steps that I walked through, but this is just Cypress running it. This is in headed mode, so when we run in headless, it does actually run a lot faster than this, but this is still really speedy anyway. I think we're looking at 15 seconds to close this out, depending on my 1 minute video.
It is faster than manual testing, that's for sure.
Yeah. Cool. So to drop out of the regression suite, I'm then going to go into Cypress dashboard. So I'm just going to highlight another area of our product here, because talking about Cypress dashboard, I want to talk about test retries. So this is me just adding in a text block to a guide. But what you'll notice is when I add the text, it updates the guide preview as well. And here we need to, when we're running our tests, we need to make sure, even in CI, that as well as updating the text, that we're updating the guide preview correctly. And if you can imagine the timing of jumping between these steps, so adding it in, it appears almost instantly. But when you're running that in CI, or you're running a long string of text, or you're adding a video block, or you're adding an image, it can get quite complicated, and the timings are all the more important. So I want to kind of call this out as an example of where retries has helped us, because at a point where Cypress would, get an element and attempt to retry that test. It would attempt to assert on that element, but maybe it hadn't finished. Cypress retries will then continue to test that element again, which has been a massive benefit for us, especially with tests like these, because we do a lot of asserting, obviously, on the guides are updating correctly. So following the popular approach of step 1, 2, question marks, and profit, I'm just going to run into our use of test retries and the benefits we saw from that. So the first point for enabling test retries is that it was really easy for us. All you had to do was update to the required version. And for us, we just updated our Cypress JSON, or the config file we used. We just added them for the run mode. But you can, I just kind of linked in here, you can dig into the docs and add them for specific tests. For us, though, it was just a case of updating it globally. We were happy to do so. And I figured I'd just call out as well briefly for anyone who didn't know, if I ran through it a bit too quickly, test retries is the feature where Cypress will automatically retry a failed test prior to marking it as failed. So it will go over it again rather than just failing, oh, this test failed, but if you rerun it, it'll pass again. It'll try that as many times as you configure. So here in this example, we're doing it 3 times in the run mode. So we put that into our CI. And then the second step of checking the Flaky tests in Cypress dashboard. So this is really important, because I think one of the things that people can think, and one of the first things that people might be kind of typing out now while hearing about test retries is, well, are you masking the failures? A test fails and then Cypress is trying it again and just passing. But for us, what this really is doing is it's stopping the false red alerts. It's stopping the situation where your release tests have failed and you need to look at this right now. And then you find out it's a problem with a test. It's not actually a problem with the application. What we can actually do by using retries is we can have Cypress retry the test and pass, record the failure for us, and then go into Cypress dashboard, investigate the flaky tests, and basically keep on top of them from there. And we can do this as more of a reactive effort rather than immediately jumping on a fire and, and thinking it's a major problem. So I've just kind of got a couple of examples here from our Sanity suite, and you can even see like 10 and 1 out of 300 runs is really minor. So we can work on fixing that, but we don't need to jump on that if it fails as if there's something that we need to block for our current release.
Right.
So question marks, but then the profit. So let's talk a bit about the before. As I just kind of mentioned then, the flaky test will fail and the engineer will jump on it as a priority. And then upon investigation, an engineer will notice that a test has failed. Potentially, you can find that when you're doing this as well, when working on a dev branch, it can be unrelated to what you're working on. So suddenly, 1 or 3 point story, and then you find that you need to fix a test that you don't know why is failing, then inflates the work that you're doing. So, or a release point, it's just distracting from something else that somebody could be working on. And then, so the engineer is either going to fix the test or just rerun it and notice that it passes a second time and move forward. So now afterwards, using retries, the flaky test will fail. Cypress will retry the test the number of times that you've specified. So like I say, we use 3, and then the test will pass. The flaky failure is then recorded in the test results of Cypress dashboard. And then as a team, we can work through those flaky tests that are recorded, We've got all the test evidence that we need from the videos that are recorded, the steps that have failed. If anything, actually seeing that failure multiple times with history makes it a bit more easier to pinpoint the failure, rather than if you see it fail once on the fly and you don't have all the details and you're jumping on this kind of unexpectedly, it's a lot more difficult to fix rather than having all the information there.
Exactly. It gives you actual statistics, right? So that you can decide if it's top priority or can be looked at later, but not right now.
Exactly. So it's not even, hiding the problem. It's just choosing to prioritize it depending on how important it is, rather than when you're at a point of a release, it jumps straight to the top because those tests fail. You need to jump on whatever they're failing for.
And I just want to add really quickly, in our docs, you can specify globally for entire project. You can specify, like George did, only enable in CI mode and not open mode. And you can also specify per suite of tests or for a single test. So you can disable it globally and just say, just retry this particular test because I know it's flaky, and then fix it later.
Yeah. So how long does it take to run these tests? So for sanity, I called out there a light touch of the different areas of the Visual Design Studio. So we're looking at about 4.5 minutes. This is running them though in parallel as well, but there's not too much to see here. They run fast. We expect them to be fast. We don't want necessarily every time somebody pushes a commit to have to, wait 30 seconds for CI to build. We wanted them to be fast and to keep things moving at a decent pace. Regression though, we're running at an average of 17 minutes or so. This is on 4 machines. So we're saving a lot of time here from running them in parallel. And the spike in the center I actually kept in to kind of show the point of how much time we're saving in parallel. This dug into this, and there was either a configuration issue or a billing issue that stopped our test from running in parallel temporarily. So you can actually see how much that time started to spike before we sorted it. So yeah, we we definitely benefit from running them in parallel, getting them done a lot quicker. Cool. So putting down Cypress dashboard, talking about our Slack channel reporting. So this is having the results from Cypress dashboard report into a specific Slack channel. For us, this provides a clear visibility of the test results. It empowers the whole team to own the tests and enables us to build a process around monitoring these failures. So to talk about that a bit, actually having the test results be brought sort of to the team, brought to an application that we're using daily, rather than relying on people to go kind of digging into Cypress dashboard is like huge for us. It means that we can like create a channel, bring everyone in the team in it, and make sure that we're owning that as a team, commenting on the failures as a team. That was our first kind of vision with the initial increment of making the regression run nightly. It meant that, okay, the next day the tests have ran, do we have any failures? Is there anything we need to look into? Or do we see like a nice pass message?
Right.
And as I mentioned, that allows us to kind of build a process around that. So it's not just kind of looking into it. It's like a ownership and a commitment from the team in owning these tests and making sure that they still pass as we'd expect them to. So popping down Slack and talking about our test case management system. So by using the plugins that were available from Cypress, we're actually able to report our test results off into our test case management software. So this is a huge win for us because it gives us like a one source of truth for our release testing. So when we look into our test cases, we can see all of our manual tests and all of our automated tests in one location, which is huge. And we use, in terms of the kind of implementation of that, we actually have a flag that when we're running the test in CI, we update the reporter in the config. So we're actually using a separate reporter to add into these results rather than just the default, which is probably just go to Cypress dashboard for us. So that just reports to a Mocha reporter that we use from the available plugins. Yeah, so to summarize, we now have an increased product test coverage of around 34%. We have an increased test run speed of about 74% by running the tests in parallel. We've had an increase in our NPS scores for quality. So this was big for us. We started off with an idea of improving quality. It was a drive across the engineering teams, and it was nice to see this increase come through. We do feel like that using Cypress helped us reach the goals that we'd set ourselves. and a surge of Cypress adoption and progression across our teams. So I showed the list of products at the start. I showed this kind of example with guidance. We have other products, we have other teams, everyone's working together, and there's a huge push across mainly like our core application as well, which is doing a lot of this on a bigger scale. So it's really great to see how our whole kind of engineering teams have all kind of pushed and adopted Cypress and are making huge changes to it, which is great for us. There's sanity tests running on every PR. We have the regression tests running nightly. So they could always be improved in the future to run upon like merge of the actual release branch, but at the minute, we just have them running every night and keep monitoring of them. As I mentioned, these tests create the guides, so they're independent, and it allows us to kind of leverage the best practice of using it only. So as soon as you run into a problem with a test, because the test is completely independent and it doesn't require any other test steps to run, you can literally just append .only to the it block. And that'll mean that when you run it and test it, whether it's in headless or headed, it'll only run that individual test, which was a big thing for us to help us jump on and look at tests quicker when we're investigating issues. And a unified approach to selecting elements. So following the best practice of just using data attributes, this means that whenever people are tagging elements for storage in different areas of the application, we know the best practice to follow, and everyone's unified on that approach. The stable tests, so running into less flake by preventing unnecessary waits. So instead of just using, certain amounts of time, we wait on routes and such, which mean that they run more consistently and stable, which is a big win for us. And the potential flake is controlled by the test retries. So we can still run into issues. The app can run at different speeds. We can sometimes run into these failures where we need Cypress to retry it again and pass. So that's a big win for us, rather than having it report the failure and then, like I've talked about, go back in and dig into them and look at the results. Visibility of test suites and results. So we have our results and metrics tracked in Cypress dashboard. And for manual automated test results, they're presented in our test case management system as well. So when we talk about visibility, getting leadership buy-in and such, it's really great for us to be able to say, here are our tests, here are all the results, and everyone be able to see that. And a team-driven maintenance process for owning and fixing the tests. So as I've already spoke about, the team themselves can create the Slack channel, get the test reporting into it, and really just dig in, thread any failures and such, and talk about those and get them fixed. Yeah, answer questions, I think now.
Yes, George, thank you for the presentation. There is a question that I think is the top one with 15 upvotes. As a quality engineer, which you are, what's the main challenge in implementing the quality culture in Pendo, and how did Cypress help with that? What do you think the main challenge was culturally?
I think the main challenge, really, when you're talking of something culturally, is the main challenge of getting that buy-in, getting everybody involved, which is one of the kind of key pieces I want to talk about. So with this change, and to kind of answer as well, how did Cypress help with that? So having a product that was easy to adopt, easy to work with, it meant that it was easier to get that adoption, to get that buy-in, to get everybody to look at quality in the same way. So, because to be honest, and I guess the thing of Pendo, people didn't really necessarily need convincing. It already has that kind of open culture. It's really just like everybody getting on board, looking at it in the same way. But it's really, like I say, the adoption factor, getting people on board, just following the same sort of process and steps. And Cypress helped with that by making it easy to do so. Everything that I've just kind of spoke about, so that people can look at a test suite, know that it's stable, know that it's doing its job, know that they can jump in and help, and maybe just have a quick look online, refresh themselves on some docs if they need to know how to do something. That gets everybody involved and everyone pitched in together, I find.
Can I ask, was there any tricks to get management buy-in, right? Because they still like, why do you need another tool? Why do you have to learn it? Did you do anything specific for to get the management on board, or was it just like engineer driven?
Well, I think management were really like on board from us from the beginning because it was a drive across Pendo to improve quality. So there was a big focus on, engineering. How can we do this? What do we need to do? So it was like the buy-in was there. It was a case of us coming up really with an answer in what we wanted to do, and then being able to show those metrics, dig into Cypress dashboard. That's where then it's easy. It's more about maintaining that buy-in, showing what the tests deliver. Okay, yes, now we've built a suite, but what is it doing? How is it benefiting us? Other improvements we can make. That's the bigger piece.
Well, and you probably showed that video of the test covering all the stories and says, now we know it works, right? And it will work forever as long as the test pass.
Yeah.
This is a great question that comes in again and again. Do you mock API calls, or your tests are just spying using signed reset, or do we actually stop with signed reset? What's your strategy usually?
So for the guide specifically and the whole suite I've been talking about, everything's against like real endpoints. So we can actually use the application, run, wait for everything. We're happy to do that. The regression tests run slower. We know that we're loading a lot into them and we're happy to do so. With our core application, kind of talking a bit away from guides, there's a lot more stubbing that's done. There's a lot more fixturing of data. It's just more convenient and not always like as necessary in those tests. We just need data to appear. So we find that it's a lot more convenient for us to use fixtures when we're reporting from our core product. But for guides, everything's pretty much endpoints. The only time we'd really stub data is if we ran into some sort of issue that caused us to do so.
Gotcha. And this is kind of related to the next upvoted question, right? Managed test precondition. And I believe they meant data, right? The backend. And you said that some tests create everything, other tests assume there is already data there, right?
Yeah. So this is our kind of talking a bit about our sanity and regression suite. So we manage the test preconditions for regression by moving everything into the before calls or the before each calls, or there's even some actions that we just have running on the actual Cypress test runner itself before we even get into the tests. So we took care of those preconditions by loading them into the before calls of the test. That also means as well that if a problem occurs that isn't actually to do with the test, is to do with the setup, it's easier to identify because you'll see that the before has failed. And it's actually a lot cleaner that way, because if you have 5 tests that are requiring the same precondition, you load it into a before each. If the first one fails, the first before each check, it will just skip the rest of those tests. And by that, you're not running a test 5 times and seeing 5 failures. It runs once, reports the before has failed, and then skips the rest. So that's how we normally deal with that.
Very good suggestion. We should actually add it to best practices, right? Put all your preconditions into before each so that you skip tests that for sure will fail if the first test failed, for example, with precondition. A question that I think is on many people's minds: who is writing test scenarios, right? Product managers, QAs, developers, outside contractors?
Outside contractors, can you imagine? It feels like, I don't know if this is a get out, but it's both. Like as a team, and this is the point of team owning quality, we have sessions where we'll talk through the cards, and usually we have like feature leads for particular cards, and our product management team will work on writing out like user scenarios, so how the product's going to be used, what we need to think about, and what's the intended usage of this feature. And then together we'll think of test scenarios. So in reality, like if you were going to say somebody owns it, it would be the quality engineer of the team. But you do find that because it happens during like refinement sessions where everyone's sat in together, everyone sort of pitches in with this. But we'll generally have, as part of like user scenarios of how we intend it to be used and the kind of walkthroughs of the feature, we'll have test scenarios in there as well, and edge cases that get thought about. And this is kind of applied to the automation standpoint as well, because once this is done before the card is brought into the sprint, it means that whether it's if a front-end engineer is working on these Cypress tests, they already have pretty much everything spec'd out that they need to automate proactively.
I see. When we write those test scenarios, we write something, right, in some document, right? They're not writing, empty placeholder Cypress test with everything committed out, right? Log in, find the element. No, right? It's the engineer who will actually take the doc and create the Cypress test, right?
Yeah, I don't think we get into the specifics of what the test needs to contain unless we find that there's something that we know we should do, or if there's a call out that we need to consider. But usually it's more generic, it's more kind of user focused and feature focused than it is kind of technically focused.
Gotcha. Question. Oh, although upvotes really are great today, right? Like the top question is the most interesting one. Do you have
Yeah.
experience with Cypress for different types of testing? So you showed us end to end, right? You can also write unit tests, right? Like test for small pieces of code. Right now we just released Cypress 7, so component level testing. But you can also do like API testing with Cypress. Do you use separate tools for those types of tests?
So using Cypress for different types of testing. So even calling it end to end, we can use Cypress for our visual design studio, but our actual guides creation is launched from our core product. So there's still, like, in terms of end to end, our desired end to end would be the whole kind of domain switching, actually going from one product to another. But we are kind of using it to the full extent of the Visual Design Studio, which is great. The only other time I've used Cypress for the other types of testing is API. This is something that I've not done with Pendo because we have different types of tests that we use for our backend tests. We don't use Cypress for it at the minute. But funnily enough, it is being considered, it is being investigated by a team who are kind of saying, let's take a look at this, let's see how it looks, the pros and cons. I've already actually been involved in like chats about this, and I've kind of preached the whole, well, we'll have the one source of truth. If you bring these tests into Cypress, we'll have them in Cypress dashboard, we'll have them in our test case management tool. So, but in terms of the kind of technical capacity there, it's still being looked into. But yeah, I've used it a bit for API, and it's yeah, as simple as API tests can get. I always find that whenever I've written API tests in the past, it's the initial, and maybe I'm speaking from experience when I talk about the pain points of starting automation, but it's the initial onboarding, it's the setup, it's the infrastructure piece. When you're writing API tests, it's as quick as anything. So doing that in Cypress is just as fast, where you're literally just adding in the lines to assert on responses and codes. It's as easy as anything.
And I just will add, if you bring more types of testing to Cypress dashboard, you also bring them to Slack as well, because it will post results as well.
There you go.
Maybe a more technical question, right? You said that you clean up data, right? Especially after regression tests. Any tools or tricks for cleaning up the backend data?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think how I can answer this. So I guess the best way to say it is we have functions that will run nightly, similar to like scheduled jobs. So this is outside of Cypress, but the way our environments are set up and configured, we have full access to the databases and everything that's created. So we just have commands that are run. I believe that they're built in as part of the project, and they'll basically just run each night and just clear out the required locations without like damaging the application. So we're clearing out guides, but we're also making sure that the rest of the environment works correctly where it may reference guides and such. So still a bit vague when I kind of refer to it, but that's how we do it.
Gotcha. Thank you. You explained at length, how to handle flaky tests. You explained how you run tests for each PR. This is an interesting question, and I'm looking forward to your honest answer. Did you run into any limitations with Cypress, and what are those?
So, honest answer, yes. Like, it is a complicated product, and this was one of the things I was actually going to consider kind of talking about. So it's a very good question to ask. So this is something that I find is quite easy to turn into a positive, and I actually talked about this internally at Pendo, and we did run into limitations with it. But one of the great things is we overcame the limitations, and we found that whether Cypress had provided solutions to the product, because you can't do everything at once. You can't solve every kind of edge case problem at once, and especially with an application like ours. So one of the kind of issues we ran into is we're running all of our testing in an iframe application, which currently the snapshots in headed mode don't support.
Yeah.
But I did notice activity on that issue like within the past couple of weeks. So I remember seeing it like moving around. It got a new label, so I was excited. So So we can work with that though. Like we can run the tests in headless mode, record the clips, and it's quite easy just to kind of step through and see the same thing that you would see in a snapshot. One of the other things we ran into where we're getting things a bit more complicated is having the ability to retry the get of a particular element. So Cypress will get an element and then retry the assertions on it. We ran into situations where we wanted to actually retry getting the entire element itself. I believe there's a live issue for this as well. And this is the thing though, like, so normally you could run into a problem like that. So you start running with automation tools and you hit a stop and then you stop using it because you can't solve the problem. But we were able to solve these problems from community-driven answers and questions and open issues. So yeah, we did run into roadblocks, but I'm happy to say that we managed to surpass them all, which is really great.
It's good to hear. It's good to hear. Yes, and recreating the iframes is definitely something. But I can see a problem for your use case. We're almost out of time. Maybe one last question, George. Whatever you want to answer from the choices in front of you.
I mean, the top one, because it's kind of a 20 thumbs up, I can just quickly say, we use the data attributes on the majority of our elements. I think there is still some work we're doing to kind of get this at like a component level where we're using elements in like different locations. But for the most part, we just jump in and update the files ourselves. So yeah, for like the majority of the products, and that's why I called out in that example, we're using data attributes quite happily. Don't know if I'll get through any of the others quick enough.
We'll answer them, offline. The questions are all on Slido account, so we can answer them later. Why don't we go to the last slide, George, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
Well, George, and everyone listening, I want to thank you for participating in this webinar, George. You put so much time and effort into putting the slides together and explaining what you've done at Pendo. So this is great to hear. I hope it's useful to everyone who joined our webinar. Any last words, George, before we stop the webinar?
No, I guess just thanks for having me. It was a great opportunity. I'm glad we got to do this. And I didn't include it in the initial shout out, but I did set up a Twitter for this in case people do have other questions they wish to ask. So you can find that in the slides, and I'll try and be active on there if people have questions that I can answer. But I'm guessing we'll look at the Slido ones as well.
Well, thank you. If you have questions, definitely contact George on Twitter, because he has done an amazing job. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.